everyone. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, boa tarde. Welcome back to the Lloyd's Academy for the Latin America and the Caribbean market. Today is the session, one session before the last one we're going to have into 2021. I hope you've been enjoying all of the sessions we've been presented, and we are so happy to have you with us again. On the agenda today, we have cyber risks, and I want to introduce you to Paul Gooch, our speaker of this session today. Paul, are you there? I hope so. I want to just say that Paul Gooch is the cyber underwriter within the enterprise risk division at Tokio Marine Kyun. He joined Tokio Marine Kyun in 2009 and has a background in commercial property and business interruption insurance, with a particular focus on manufacturing heavy industrial risks. Paul is graduated from University College London in 2008 with an honors degree in politics, specializing in US, Europe, Russia relations. So I will now hand over to Paul. So he's going to be presenting to you all about cyber risks. Paul, please, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marco, and thanks for everyone for joining me today. There's actually quite a lot going on in the slides I've put together, so I'm actually going to switch off my video just while I go through the slides to prevent any unnecessary distractions. And so in there we go. So in October 2017, I was fortunate enough to be invited to Sao Paulo by Lloyd, Brazil, to give a talk on cyber insurance as part of their class of business workshop. And at the beginning of that talk, I put up a slide of a recent Economist cover, which declared that data was now the world's most valuable resource. Now, fast forward 4 years. Sadly, I'm not giving this talk in Brazil. I'm in the living room of my flat in London. I'm at least 10 pounds heavier thanks to the COVID lockdowns. And a recent Economist front cover somewhat ominously looks like this. Now, for those of you that can't read the headline, because it's a bit small, it's titled Broadbanditis, the Surging Threat from Spies and Crooks. Indeed, in the 4 years since I gave that presentation, there has been an explosion in cybercrime, particularly ransomware. Now, I suppose that's hardly surprising. If data is indeed the world's most valuable resource, we shouldn't be shocked to find out that criminals are focusing their efforts on getting hold of it. Often reminded of the infamous criminal Willie Sutton, and was rumored to have said when he was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" Criminal gangs moved in cyberspace because that's where the money is. So the focus of this presentation is going to be how the cyber market has developed over the past 4 years and how it has responded to ransomware, both in terms of how cyber insurance policies have responded to ransomware claims, and also how the cyber market in general has responded to a huge increase in the frequency and severity of ransomware incidents. So first of all then, premium growth. So back in 2017, global cyber insurance premium were around $4.7 billion US. Figures for 2020 are typically quoted as being around $7 to $8 billion, with forecast growth to over 20 billion in 2025. So that's obviously good news. That's the good news from an insurer's perspective. But onto the bad news. So here we can see the growth in recorded ransomware attack attempts since 2017. This data has been taken from Sonic Wall's cyber threat report. Interestingly, in that chart, we see a dip in 2019, which doesn't really correlate with our observations in the cyber market. In terms of claims, it didn't drop off for us, but we did see the explosion you see there in 2020. And perhaps most concerning, on to the next slide, is that in the first half of 2021, the number of recorded ransomware attack attempts that Sonic Wall have recorded in their cyber threat report has surpassed the total number in the whole of 2020. And so from a Latin American perspective, you see that the US dominates the cases. You see from that quite dramatic bar chart. But Latin America does have 3 of the top 10 territories listed in this threat report, being Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. And here is just a selection of high-profile organizations and headlines for companies that have been hit across Latin America. And what you'll notice is the wide array of different industries affected. So banking, telecommunications, retail, manufacturing, energy. So really, nobody's safe. Everyone is being targeted by ransomware crime gangs. Often, I think those of us like me who work in the cyber market day in, day out forget that other people's lives aren't dominated by ransomware like ours is. So I appreciate not all members of this audience will know a huge amount about it. So I thought it was worthwhile to have a very brief recap of what exactly ransomware is. Now, if you're unfortunate enough that your computer is infected with ransomware, you'll be presented with a delightful message like this. This is, I believe, taken from the Maze group, telling you that your folders have been encrypted and therefore cannot be accessed, which renders your computer useless. And informing you need a special decryption software tool to get your data back. And guess who has that software? The criminals. Then it will give you a price for the decryptor, typically quoted in Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency for the sake of the criminals' anonymity. There'll usually be a time limit put on this for the time to pay the ransom. And if you don't pay before that time limit, it will tell you how much it will go up by. Typically, it doubles. More recently, we've seen a growth in what's referred to as triple extortion. So the first element is what we've become accustomed to, and that's the scenario I just outlined, basically denying you access to your computer system. The second element is stealing your confidential data, perhaps the medical or financial records of your employees or customers, and threatening to release that data on the internet unless a ransom is paid. And the third element tends to occur when a victim is not cooperating. So perhaps they're refusing to pay a ransom or attempting to negotiate the price down. The criminals will find other ways to target you. Perhaps some element of your network has been restored, perhaps your website, and then they'll flood that with traffic in what's known as a distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS. We've also seen cases where customer data was stolen and the criminals have contacted the victim's customers directly, threatening them with the release of the information, so seeking ransom payments from the customer as opposed to the insured. And just on that, the second piece, the doxing, here's actually an extract from a ransomware note left by the prolific ransomware group known as Maze in their attack on Banco BCR in Costa Rica. This isn't the entire ransom note, it's much longer than this, but these are the key kind of extracts. And you'll note reference to the 11 million credit card records or credentials that were stolen. Particularly US citizens being involved, criminals thinking they can drive a higher price if Americans are affected. And also note the ominous sign-off, will be watching for the consequences. So that's what a ransomware attack looks like. In terms of how the insurance policy responds, here are the typical heads of cover that will be triggered. And ransomware really does trigger pretty much every head of cover under a ransomware policy. The most obvious being extortion payments. These are usually covered. They're typically a last resort if the insured cannot recover from backup. And it's deemed that the only way to restore the computer network is to just pay the ransom. Obviously, there are legal implications, so law enforcement may need to get involved, and special care needs to be taken to ensure that no payment is made to any sanctioned entity. In fact, US OFAC are becoming more active in this area. And in December 2019, they sanctioned a notorious ransomware group known as Evil Corp. Next, you've got incident response costs. These are typically IT forensic costs. So it costs to hire experts to analyze your network to work out how best to recover from the attack, but also any cost of notifying customers whose data may have been compromised in the attack. Data restoration costs. If you find that your data can be restored from backup, you may need to hire a third party to do this, or pay your staff overtime to do it. In many cases, data can't be cleanly restored from backup. They therefore need to be recreated from scratch, which can be very costly. Business interruption cover. This really mirrors the type of cover you'd find in a property policy. It's the loss of profit in the event that your business operations are impacted. These usually make up the largest element of the biggest ransomware events, especially for major companies. Legal expenses and liability. So we mentioned that crime groups are targeting confidential information. Well, if you have a duty to protect that information, you may be sued for damages, which is particularly costly when it comes to class action lawsuits. Regulatory fines and penalties. So most countries around the world, and Latin America, have enacted data protection regulations, which require you to protect personally identifiable information, or PII, as we refer to it. And so the victim may be subject to a regulatory investigation and possibly a fine or penalty. Then finally, reputational harm. Some policies offer this add-on. Being a victim of a ransomware attack, especially if customer data is stolen, isn't a great look for a company. It's quite damaging to their reputation. So this element of coverage covers PR costs, but also the loss of business resulting from reputational damage. So if you do suffer any customer attrition, a loss of customers, and therefore a loss of sales, it's a loss of profit cover linked to the reputational harm. And this here is an extract from Palo Alto Network's Unit 42 Research Division, looking at costs with respect to ransomware incidents in 2020 in the US, Canada, and Europe. As key points noted there, the average ransom demand for a large enterprise is almost $3 million, so certainly not chump change looking at here. As you'll see, the highest ransom paid, according to this study, was $10 million in 2020. Now, it has been reported by major news networks that a large US insurer paid a $40 million ransom earlier this year. That company hasn't confirmed or denied that, but it has been reported by reputable news agencies. So as we can see, very, very costly to insurers. We can see there also the kind of the forensic engagement costs, obviously getting larger and larger as the size of the business affected increases. So then, given what we've seen in the insurance market, how has the market actually responded? So firstly, unsurprisingly, there have been rate increases as insurers' costs have risen dramatically, so have premiums. It's worth noting that between 2017 and 2020, there was a period of real severe softening in the market, rate reductions and broadening of coverage, which did culminate in somewhat of a perfect storm with respect to loss ratios, given the increase in claims that we've seen, notably ransomware. What we've seen in our book is a hardening market with rates continuing to increase as we get through the year. Our average rate increase for 2021 was 60%, but we have seen accounts paying in excess of 100% increase for particularly underpaid accounts, or obviously those with loss activity or perhaps inadequate security. We've also seen reduced capacity in the market, and this has really manifested itself in three ways. We've seen some markets completely exit the space altogether, a number of pullouts, both syndicates and also MGAs being unable to renew their binders and get renewal capacity. Those who have remained in the market are tending to reduce their overall line sizes on programs. So, for example, carriers who may have deployed up to 25 million on a single program, now typically reducing that to 10 or 15 million. Now that's it's not to say that you can't get 25 million capacity from a single insurer. You certainly can, but it's less frequent in the current market environment. Line size deployment is also now more dependent upon attachment point. Quite a common deployment of capacity in the cyber market used to be 100% of 10 million stretches. So there'd be one market writing 100% of a primary 10, and then another market writing 100% of a 10x10. Typically, the lower down the program you are, the smaller the capacity a carrier is willing to provide. And so it's quite common now to see either primary 5 million or a quota share placement. Thirdly, we've seen coverage restrictions also come into place. So these are either ransomware sublimits, so the most you can claim at any one event is limited to beneath the policy limit. Ransomware co-insurance, so the insured retains a portion of the loss where a ransomware event occurs. And finally, the kind of harshest provision are ransomware exclusions. We typically see these being applied where cybersecurity controls are deemed to be inadequate. And this takes us to the final point, which is risk selection with respect to cybersecurity controls. There are a number of common themes and attack techniques that insurers have observed, for which I thought it was worth touching on in some more detail, given the expected audience here. So here we have some common ransomware attack techniques that we've observed on many claims that we have seen. It should be stressed that this really is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of ways that you can be hit by a ransomware attack. But if I had to condense the most common attack vectors into an abbreviated list for a presentation such as this, then this would certainly be it. Now, these are sort of credential theft down, they're kind of in order of what often happens in a ransomware attack. Vulnerability exploits are a more general issue. They can occur at any stage in the attack. And what a vulnerability is it's where a piece of legitimate software is found to have a bug that can be exploited to launch a ransomware attack. So this can allow initial entry into a system or make it easier for an attacker to move around the network once they're in. So any change in what we refer to as the kill chain in a cyber attack. A recent example was the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, which you may have heard of. It was discovered that the bug in the software used to support Microsoft email servers allowed attackers to set up a backdoor into the victim's networks, and therefore use that to gain entry. We've also seen a rise in what's known as supply chain attacks, and these are particularly difficult to defend against. So this is where an attacker compromises one of your vendors. So let's say it's your security software provider. They suffer a breach, somebody gets into their network, and because they have access to your network, they get in via a kind of a legitimate backdoor. And obviously there's good economy of scale for criminals to do this, because if you attack one service provider, you can then get access to many clients' systems and networks. For those of you that have heard of the SolarWinds breach, this was an example of such an attack. So lots of companies use SolarWinds. SolarWinds were breached, and therefore their connections to your networks were exploited to get into your systems. So in terms of what underwriters look for here, really a strong vulnerability management program, and patch management is key. So the patch is the fix you apply to a vulnerability. So for example, when the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability was announced, Microsoft issued a patch and said, if you install this, it removes the vulnerability. Now, previously, when you would read a cyber insurance application, the question would say, do you patch within 30 days? Now it's closer to 30 hours, because we've seen these vulnerabilities being exploited incredibly quickly by the criminals. So we really do expect critical patches to be deployed within 24 to 72 hours, because like I said, they can be exploited very quickly. So that's a general piece on vulnerability exploits. Like I said, they can occur at any stage, not necessarily at the start, can be at the start, middle, or near the end. Also linked to the use of legacy systems if you're using outdated equipment, so Windows XP, things like that, which aren't supported by Microsoft anymore. Those are generally prone to vulnerabilities, and Microsoft won't issue patches for that kind of system. So it's difficult to make sure they're secure. So we don't want to be insuring people generally with large legacy unsupported IT estates. So then moving on to kind of more in sequential order of how a ransomware attack often occurs. Firstly, there's often credential theft. So this is where a user has their username and password stolen, typically by clicking on a malicious link in a phishing email. Criminals are getting more and more adept at targeting their emails, so they look like genuine emails as opposed to the kind of outlandish emails previously, which were more kind of spam kind of phishing. So in terms of what underwriters look for as they underwrite around this risk, are you preventing phishing emails getting through? So are you using email filtering tools which stop the emails landing in the inbox in the first place? Members of the audience may be familiar with tools such as Proofpoint or Mimecast. These are automated tools that try and prevent the email from getting to the employee in the first place. If the email does get through, are your employees trained to identify it? Many of you may work at companies who run phishing tests, so we want to know, are our employees trained to spot such emails? And finally, a very important piece is, let's say that your employee is tricked and they do give up their credentials. Can an attacker use those credentials to log in remotely? Do you use some kind of multi-factor authentication or MFA? MFA has been a huge focus for the cyber insurance market recently. Many of you have been working from home during COVID, will be familiar with it. It's a RSA key or authenticator app or text message, something like that, which is required alongside your username and password. Now, you've implemented, even if your employee has given up their username and password, then the third factor authentication, as long as the criminal hasn't got hold of that, stops the criminal getting in with just the username and password. It's no exaggeration to say that MFA is probably the most scrutinized control of all at the moment in the cyber insurance market. I would say it's very difficult for customers to get full limit ransomware cover if MFA is not in place for remote access. Marco, I did just notice that somebody, I think, had their hand up. I think we were taking questions at the end, although I'm happy to take questions in the middle.
I don't think we have questions. I'm monitoring the questions Q&A, but I should have said that if anyone has a question, please just write them down on the Q&A button here you can see that on your screen, and we're going to be asking those questions in the end. So go ahead, please, Paul.
Cool, great. Yeah, sorry, I just saw someone with their hand up, but it's gone down now. So I will then move on. Just take a sip of water. So next is something called, we refer to as privilege escalation. So if I'm an attacker and I've stolen a set of regular credentials, so a regular employee's username and password, what I want to try and do is to gain access to a more powerful set of administrator credentials. So I have access to more data and basically do more damage. So if within companies you work for, the credentials of an IT network administrator, for example, would allow the attacker to do a lot more than the credentials of an average employee. They will have access to certain things, they will have to run certain software and processes. And so that's what the attackers are looking for. They're looking to what we refer to as escalate privilege, so get their hands on more powerful user credentials. And so what underwriters are really looking for there are, do your staff have to have separate accounts for their regular day-to-day activities and their privileged access activities? You don't want somebody with powerful credentials using it to browse the internet or send emails. Also, you see multi-factor authentication there again. Is there another layer of MFA required to access privileged access credentials? Do you store these kind of credentials in a vault as well, which have to be checked in and out rather than being kind of a permanent username and password? And do you limit the functionality of those accounts? So if somebody were to get hold of them, there are only certain things that they can do if they are compromised. So let's assume that attackers got in, they've escalated privilege. Next, what they probably try and do is what we refer to as lateral movement. So what that means is once an attacker has compromised one machine, they don't just want to stay there and damage that single machine. They want to move across your network and access as many resources and as many workstations as possible, so they can cause as much damage as possible. And this is what we refer to as moving laterally across the network. So what underwriters want to see here is particularly what we refer to as network segmentation. So if a user has access to one area of a network, how easily can they get to another area? And what we look for are firewalls. So somebody who works in the accounts department, do they need access to the sales department? That's probably not required. So you may put in kind of access controls, so that if somebody does get into somebody's account, they can't easily move around. Also tools such as IDS, IPS, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. So these are got technology in place to detect this kind of movement across the network and check for suspicious or anomalous activity. Fileless malware. So in the old days, computer viruses really were more specific executable files, which they could be detecting using signatures. So your old-fashioned antivirus would have a signature list, and it would check new files on the system against this list of signatures, and if any of them showed up, they would be blocked. The problem is with a lot of ransomware techniques we see these days is that they aren't detected by traditional antivirus because there is no signature to detect. So even though a client may have some kind of antivirus on the system, if it's a more traditional signature-based version, it's unlikely to pick up on many strains of ransomware or many types of ransomware attack. So really what underwriters are looking for more and more here are tools that analyze behaviors rather than look for signatures. So if there is unusual activity or something's happening which doesn't typically happen across your network or on your machine, then, or if it's kind of behavior that the software vendor has previously picked up is a common kind of behavior seen in ransomware attacks, the software picks this up and then hopefully blocks it. These are commonly referred to as endpoint detection and response tools, or EDR tools for short. And then aside from kind of the software tools, we also look for kind of manual steps you can take. So disabling macros and JavaScript and certain types of scripting which are abused by attackers. Some of you may have seen if you use Microsoft Excel that a message will say that macros are disabled by default. That's a kind of security provision, because macros are often abused to kind of plant ransomware into your computer. And finally, if we assume that the attacker has stolen credentials, they've escalated privilege, they've moved laterally across the network, they've evaded detection, and they've launched a successful ransomware attack across your network, so you've been presenting with that lovely screen that we saw earlier, your last result is to restore from backup. The problem is attackers are aware of this, and so they look for your backup data. And if it's connected to your network, guess what? They encrypt that data as well, making it impossible to return your systems because they're all locked up as well. Somewhat ironically, as technology has advanced, this has become easy to do as more and more companies store their backup data in the cloud. Most companies outsource some element of their IT now into the cloud, so whether it be Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud or Microsoft Cloud. They store backup data in the cloud, which can be great for a responsiveness point of view. So it's quicker to upload and download from the cloud than it is to get old-fashioned backup tapes. But the problem is they can become infected. So underwriters now look for old-fashioned tape backups. So if they're physically disconnected from the network, the virus obviously, or the ransomware, can't jump across the air gap to infect the tapes, so they should be protected. This isn't always feasible. Sometimes companies store too much data, or they need access to the data quicker than is available than when you back up off site on the tape. And so when they are backing up online, We want to see how you're limiting access to the backup. So do you limit it to certain employees? Are there extra protections? And MFA, do you use MFA to limit access to the backup data? One technique that is becoming more popular is the use of what are called immutable backups. So this means that once the backup is created, it cannot be overwritten. So whether that be unintentionally or by design by a ransomware actor, it's immutable, so it cannot be overwritten. So given all of that, I think I've painted, frankly, a pretty bleak landscape. So try and end on a positive note. And that's really with the advantage of the Lloyd's market model. Now, Lloyd's is a subscription market, obviously made up of many managing agents. And as I noted earlier, with how has the market responded to this huge increase in ransomware claims, we have seen a reduction in capacity, especially on primary layers, which of course more first loss. And so, of course, the subscription model enables Lloyd's underwriters to limit their line size while still offering the client a single policy. So we have seen a resurgence in the market of quota share business being written in Lloyd's. And what helps there is with a really well-established Lloyd's claim scheme, even if a number of underwriters participate on a single program, claims agreement is usually limited to the lead of the second syndicate. So clients don't need to negotiate with each underwriter separately or make a claim under multiple policies when they do suffer a ransomware incident. Also, more on the kind of soft factor side, the subscription market model kind of allows for a concentration of expertise in a relatively small space. Now, obviously, due to COVID, we're not in the Lloyd's room anywhere near as much as we were, but hopefully soon we will be again. But just the fact that there is a real concentration of kind of knowledge and experience in the London market, and in Lloyd's specifically, and that kind of information sharing means that Lloyd's can adapt and evolve quickly to the changing threat landscape. And also on the other end, the subscription market model lends itself to the stratification of expertise as well. So what we've seen, and so we see, is underwriters establish themselves as kind of lead markets in particular areas where they may have expertise and experience. So we've, that could be in certain territories, that could be in certain business activities or coverage. So the kind of lead follow model lends itself to that as well, where you have an established leader who can build kind of support and confidence and capacity behind them. And I suppose finally, often as a cyber underwriter, it can feel as though ransomware is a kind of existential threat to the viability of the cyber insurance market. But it's worth remembering that for over 300 years, Lloyd's has overcome a number of catastrophic claims to maintain its place as the world's foremost insurance market. So given all of these events that we survived and plenty more, I'm sure we can survive this and come out stronger. So on that note, finished a bit quicker than my practice run, which means we've got plenty of time for questions if anybody has any.
Thank you very much, Paul. I just want to remember, if you want to just take, actually, I'm going to ask you to show a slide again. So if you could leave your presentation on the screen, but I just want to remember everyone, if you want to have a question for Paul, just write that on the Q&A box, and I will ask the question to Paul. So we have a question here, Paul, which is, do you reinsure any cyber risk in Chile for companies or individuals? In that case, how could we contact you? So that's business coming through the door.
There we go. Already pay for itself. Yes, we do. Chile is actually one of the areas I'd say where we've had the most success. Things like being able to use London market wordings and not requiring a kind of a locally registered wording for larger business helps. So yes, we do write business in Chile. We do have larger live accounts. To get it via Lloyd's, you would need to come via a Lloyd's broker. I'm sure Marco could help you with that. But yes, we do write Chilean business in the London market. So yes, absolutely.
Thanks very much, Paul. So There's an important point. I mean, the Lloyd's market is a broker's market, so you need to appoint a broker to access the Lloyd's market. So if you ask any Lloyd's broker to look for Dr. Marine Keown, for Paul Gooch, for cyber risk, I'm sure your broker is going to be pleased to take your risk to him. The other question here is, could you share a claims protocol? Do you have anything that you could share about the claims protocol, Paul?
Do you mean the Lloyd's claim scheme, or do you mean the kind of a cyber claims protocol?
Well, the person haven't said anything about that, but I would take that as a cyber. Yes, for cyber claim. Yes, that's the question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, typically how a cyber claim plays out, where it plays out well, is you'll have what we refer to as a breach coach on the policy. So this is the kind of first point of contact. It's usually a legal company with expertise in data protection and incident response, and then they will triage the incident. So you'll get our policies have access to a 24/7 hotline you can ring. That will give you access to the breach coach. They will run through. Okay, you run through what has happened, and they'll talk you what to do next. So it may be okay. Are your systems down? So therefore, you certainly need an IT forensic company to help you perhaps get them back up and running. Are you aware if any confidential data has been impacted? You may not know until the IT forensics are in place, or you may realise has the data been exfiltrated, in which case you may need to inform the people affected or the regulator, often both. Then the breach coach will take it from there. So sometimes there is a fear that the insurers will only use their panel of people, and so for instance, if you have a relationship with a law firm that is particularly strong, then as long as you agree in advance, so when the policy that you want this law firm to be handling certain claims that arise, then we do often allow that, as long as they have the expertise in that field. Sometimes we do have an issue where the client has a relationship with the law firm, but they've got no cyber or data protection experience whatsoever. So they're a great litigator, but they're not a great kind of breach response firm. So that's generally how, if you go via the breach coach, they triage the incident and get the right people involved, and then it's settled like any other, either the liability element is settled like liability claim, or the first party business interruption claim is settled as a property BI claim would be, in terms of getting loss adjusters involved.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. We have another question here from Argentina. The question is, we see that for payment processor companies, it is almost impossible to find appetite, especially for territories in Latin America. Do you think that will change soon? Because those types of companies are the ones that need the cyber coverage the most, and we cannot find enough capacity to offer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fair point. It is a very difficult class of business. They don't have a great loss history. One of the issues we find as well, especially within Latin America, is that the retentions that the companies are willing to take are quite low. From being completely upfront, from a Tokyo Marine Keown perspective, often these companies want technology E&O insurance as well, which is slightly different. It's like a professional indemnity for technology services. That isn't the coverage that we offer, so that often counts us out. But it is a difficult class to place. I mean, there's usually a market for it eventually. It's just it's been a kind of loss hit industry for quite a while, so that's why there is restricted appetite in the market.
Thank you, Paul. Can I ask you to go back to one slide where you were talking about the examples of coverage restrictions that were introduced more recently by underwriters as a response to the increase in claims?
Yes,
you had something like sublimits. Yes, sublimits, co-insurance exclusions. Could you give some examples of those cases, of those restrictions? Can you just, for the benefit of insurers that and brokers that are with us today here, if you could just
sure. So what we usually see is, I mean, there's one large, it's not a Lloyd's market, but there's one very large company market that has taken the approach where they have a application form to fill in, and it will generate a certain score for the client. So in terms of how good they think the security is, and depending on that score, they may apply a sublimit and or a co-insurance. So we do see a number of accounts where a sublimit and a co-insurance is applied, and that's usually a 50% sublimit, 50% co-insurance, which really means you've got a quarter of the limit insured. Again, they're typically applied where the carrier isn't comfortable with the security. Now, my experience in Lloyd's has been Lloyd's hasn't tended to apply these. Now, occasionally, and we have seen it, but we do see it more with the company markets. And the reason is Lloyd's can be more flexible, because if a Lloyd's market wants to limit their ransomware exposure, they can write the risk quota share. The company market often finds it harder to do that because they're running 100% of the limit. So let's say a carrier only wants 5 million ransomware exposure and they're issuing a 10 million policy, they have to sublimit. Whereas let's say Lloyd's carrier only wanted 5 million, they could write 50% of the quota limit, and another market could support. Ransomware exclusions are, they're quite rare, because most clients, if they have the exposure, don't really, a lot of the coverage is therefore being removed as an exclusion, so they're often not going to buy. We do see it occasionally. Sometimes if a client has literally just had a ransomware attack, and so therefore they can be at a much higher risk of a follow-up attack. We've seen that on a number of clients, but it's the sublimits and co-insurance that are more prevalent. But certainly I would say in the company market, less so in the Lloyd's market at the moment.
Thank you. I have another
Marco.
question here. Yes, please. Who's that?
This is Daniel, Marco. Sorry, there is one more question in the chat box, but there is also Jocelyn Naranjo, who raised her hand a while ago. I'm not sure we can make her unmute her, allow her to unmute. Oh, she lowered her hand now. But I do have a question, and I cannot write in the Q&A. So whenever you're ready for my question, let me know. There is another question in the chat box, and you have a question as well. So let me know when I can speak.
Just go ahead. Yes,
thank you, Marco. So this is Paul. Thanks for your presentation. I think it's brilliant. I was just this week on a Central American conference, and there was a presentation on cyber, interestingly enough, and I attended it, knowing that you were going to be with us here today. And one of the topics that they were raising was that there are several risks that are several companies that do not get covered, that they just are presented to underwriters, but they do not get covered, no matter how good their systems might be. And the case in point is what you just mentioned regarding this payment processing companies. Is there any other industry or type of company that you would consider a no-go from a cyber perspective? And I'm sure it has something to do with that picture that you had at the beginning of your presentation of follow, that's where the money is, right? And that probably that has something to do with it. But I'll be interested to understand what type of industries we as a market are not interested to offer coverage for.
Sure. I mean, some of this is territory dependent. So, for instance, in the US kind of public entity, municipal, state of or board of county of, they have performed very, very poorly when it comes to ransomware, and so those are difficult. There's a price for everything, but the problem with that is that sometimes the claims experience on these business activities is so high that the required premiums are very high, and the client doesn't have the budget. So you kind of go around in circles, in that you may be able to get cover, but the premium required to cover the cost of claims is too high for the client to bear. I would say, I think, I can speak from TMK's perspective. Anything where a client that's really involved in a lot of kind of data analytics of personal data, which is sometimes quite suspect in terms of how they're handling the data, kind of anything like that kind of for instance, we wouldn't, it's an extreme example, but we wouldn't insure, say, Facebook, because they're just the amount of data that they maintain and what they're doing with it is somewhat concerning, frankly. again, the airlines have been a difficult class because the coverage has been so broad. So yeah, they've got very broad cover for system failure, and airlines have glitches kind of all the time, which says, okay, they need the cover, which means they need to pay more money, but then the kind of the money they're willing to pay doesn't match what underwriters require. So it can depend on territory, but yeah, payment processes are the classic one. We don't have appetite for, like I said, technology, coverage. So that's different to industry. That's more a coverage issue, tech, but there are, a lot of companies that require tech and cyber. So that's it's not really in our expertise, and the technology side, we're not really a professional indemnity market. So yeah, it will depend on the territory, I would say, because in certain territories, some clients have been hit with more claims than others.
Thank you, Paul. We have more questions here. I'll keep going. I mean, we have until we have another 15 minutes to go, so we have time for questions, if you don't mind. So the first question I have now is Tokio Marine Kiln Lloyd's offering some alternate solutions for potential insurers that currently don't have the necessary cybersecurity in order to them offer coverage?
Yeah, so we this is why we have partnered with a service provider on the endpoint detection and response piece. So the EDR tool I said, which isn't signature-based antivirus. So we have partnered with a leading provider, probably the leading provider of that software, which provides discounted access to that technology. So we have done that. We're also looking to partner, hopefully by the end of the year, with a couple of others to offer kind of reduced access to multi-factor authentication, so remote access tools, because we do see those two as really key kind of controls to have. So that we do. We also do. We've had for a number of years kind of a service for threat intelligence as well. It's a company that staffed with people that used to work for GCHQ and MI6, essentially, of threat intelligence, so they can run kind of reports for the companies that we insure. So yeah, we do offer a number of kind of helpful, kind of helping the client get to the place they need to be to get cover.
That's good to know. Thank you. Another question. U.S. government is pushing a reform about ransomware victims who pay for attacks could be sanctioned. How does this impact the cyber policy in the reinsurance market? It is going to impact in the short time.
Yeah, so this is a big issue. So OFAC are taking more interest in this, and it's to be honest, it doesn't. From a kiln perspective, it doesn't change the way we made that much, because we were doing these checks anyway. So even before there was heightened kind of concern around this, we always made checks to see, okay, who do we know? Are we sure that the people we're paying are kind of on a sanctioned list, or are terrorists or Al Qaeda or someone? So it will now, if the US government starts saying you cannot pay ransoms, then clearly we can't insure them. Right? It wouldn't be legal. It wouldn't be justified either. So it's something we are watching carefully, but it's something we've been, our compliance team are very hot on this kind of thing already. So it's not a new issue. It just means we really have to make sure. And if you look at the advice that's put out by the FBI, for example, they very rarely, they kind of admit that there are times where the ransom may have to be paid because there's lots of stakeholder interest involved, right? There's employees, there's customers, there's shareholders. So it's quite a helpful approach. It's not, it doesn't come across as them saying you're going to be in trouble and we're trying to make your life difficult. It's them trying to kind of make this a less profitable enterprise for the criminals by trying to identify major groups that Evil Corp was sanctioned. The problem you have, of course, is that these groups disappear and reform. So the Evil Corp will just dissolve and then become a new criminal syndicate with a new anonymous identity, and it's a very difficult, very difficult area. But it's something we've been cognizant of for years and are very watching very closely. But it should be said, if the payment of ransoms was outlawed, then of course we couldn't insure them because it wouldn't be lawful.
Thank you. Well, if you want to drop your presentation, we can have you on screen. I have
Sure.
I have other questions here. Just want to take the opportunity of having you here with us to ask. So the other question is, I think you've sort of touched on that already, but just to remind people, question is, are ransomware claims the only losses being paid by the cyber insurance market? You've touched on that in your presentation, but if you want to just clarify that further a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, from an underwriter's perspective, sadly not. Cyber insurance, excuse me, does seem to still have its reputation of being very restrictive. I actually think it's the opposite. Most policies do offer very broad coverage, and they're not limited to kind of security incidents. So it doesn't have to be a hack, right? It doesn't have to be a ransomware attack or a malicious actor getting in your system. If your employee makes an error and causes a data breach, a lot of our claims are that. We still have a large number of privacy liability claims. So I would think of the cyber insurance policies being kind of two halves. You have the first party losses, so your systems are down, and then you have the third party liability. And a lot of it, a lot of our claims still come out of liability issues that are driven by human error. So yeah, it's certainly say that the ransomware losses are balanced by other losses as well. And that's why it's been tough in the market, because it's not like we've seen the losses decrease massively and then cyber has just come up. The losses were paying and maintained, and ransomware has come alongside them.
Absolutely, yeah. It's so nice to see you 4 years later, and as you said, a lot has changed since you were here with us 4 years ago. And it's nice to see the picture of Sao Paulo on your back there. So that. So the question now is for all of us from Latin America and the Caribbean here, Paul. We see a lot of talking about how cyber insurance is important, how that is going, how that is growing all over the world. But the reality is that in many countries here in the region, we are not seeing the business picking up as much as we would like to see, as much as the risk is out there. So my question to you now is, what could you say to brokers and insurers, clients of Lloyd's that are, or partners of Lloyd's here that are here with us today? How can we increase cyber insurance penetration in the region here? What would you suggest them to do, or us to help them? Oh.
I mean, I suppose just first of all, just touching on the fact that we have had two major headwinds in the last 12 to 18 months, especially one of them obvious, right, being the pandemic, which has put kind of restraints on budgets, but also the hardening of other lines. So if you buy a property in D&O and the rates are going up a lot in those areas, you maybe don't have the budget to go out and buy a brand new type of insurance. So that has been difficult. But what we found is if you approach different size of clients in different ways helps. So what we found is that for very small clients that perhaps aren't a huge cyber risk or don't have budget to really go out and spend money on a standalone cyber insurance policy, adding cyber to like a package policy. So something we offer is what's called like a white label solution. So we work with cedents who offer property and liability policies to customers, and then they'll add on a small supplement for cyber insurance onto that policy. It's usually quite a small AP to the all risks premium. The coverage is more limited, but there's less underwriting involved. It's premium for limit kind of business, quite high volume. So we've had good success there in certain territories, and that's the solution we offer. Then moving up to the kind of mid-sized clients, the M of the SME, what we find with these clients is they will have the budget for cyber insurance, but they're perhaps not quite convinced. So they want more than the policy, right? They don't just want the policy. Okay, what else? What else can you do for me? And that's where we found the kind of added benefits referred to earlier as the service providers. So say, okay, if you buy insurance with us, you also get discounted IT security software, or you'll get threat intelligence reports. So we found that those work well with the mid-sized clients, less so with the larger clients, because they often have these tools already installed, or they have big IT security departments. It's the mid-sized clients that like the help and assistance and the financial help for the tools. And then really for the larger clients, I mean, the best kind of marketing we've had has been the ransomware epidemic. I mean, when major attacks, say in the US, the Colonial Pipeline attack is in the news, risk managers start to get a tap on the shoulder from the board asking if companies have cover for such events. So it's really with those kinds of events, it's stressing that cyber insurance isn't a luxury kind of purchase. It really should be a must have, and we find it amazing. The loss activity we've seen that many clients large clients still don't purchase the cover. They immediately do after they've had a cyber incident, but obviously then it's somewhat too late. But we find kind of focused, if you break the market down into those kind of 3 tiers, different approach depending on the size of business works or has worked for us.
Yeah, I remember you saying when we were here with us last time also about regulation, the importance of data protection regulation. Now in Brazil, for instance, we have the equivalent of GDPR, the Brazilian LGPD, which is the data protection regulation, which would then drive an increase in interest from insurance buyers for cyber risk protection, just because they would be more exposed to fines and sanctions. So I guess this is also something important to develop the cyber risk business in other countries. You want to
absolutely
add that?
Yeah, I agree. But what you said, it's once the regulations start biting. So the regulations get implemented, people talk about them. It's only once companies start getting investigated and actually fined and have to notify because of the requirements, that's when people really start to stand up and take notice. So regulation being in place is one thing, and prudent companies will buy insurance then, but often you find you have to wait until the regulations start to bite and kick in, and you hear about your peers being investigated or having breaches as a report, and that's when people start to really worry. Frankly.
Yeah, excellent, Paul. I mean, we are so thankful for your session today, for your presentation, and for the discussion we had. It was such a great session. A lot of.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Shame
sure
I can't be in Brazil.
Yeah, but hopefully soon you're going to be able to travel around here, because it's not only Brazil, there are so many other countries in the region that I'm sure would be delighted to have you come and visiting. So thank you very much. I know it's late for you in London. We are still in the afternoon here, so it was great to have you with us. Thank you very, very much. Stay well, my friend, and hope to see you soon again. Oh, by the way, I just want to remind our audience here that we're going to have our last session of the Lloyd's Academy in 2021 on the 27th of October. That's going to be about aviation risks. So don't miss that. It's going to be the last one, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy as much as you have enjoyed today on the cyber risks presentation. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. Have a
Thank you very much.
good afternoon and good evening.
Bye.